My apologies. Wait just a second. Okay. Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. The junta in Myanmar didn't just did a coup, take control of the state and ignored whatever happens within the people's state of mind. It's extremely important for them to justify this movement, to say that it is for the people in Myanmar. We know that because they say they will hold a democratic election in a few years. We know that because they're going to put Suu Kyi on a trial to prove that she was guilty in the charges that they blame her. They talk about it, that there was a fraud in the former elections. This is their justification for stunning this coup in the first place. I think it's extremely important for them to change the state of mind of people. Therefore, we just think that we'll have a lot of more success if we focus on these new democratic elections or with international supervision over trying to free Suu Kyi. The main argument we're going to have is why we're likely to succeed much more in our side. Before that, 2 important points of framing. First, the metric in the debate. We think that the metric that is most important for the debate is the stable ruling for Burmese people. We are in an analysis motion. It's a global point of view. We think that what is more important is when people get much better lives. I think it's extremely important for them to have stable government for 2 main reasons. A, just economically. We think they're in a horrible situation which will be saved only with a stable government. We think that they don't have global trade right now because they're literally wars in the street that companies just don't want to trade with them right now. It also makes them very risky for external investors to invest in the states, to build new businesses, to hire people for new jobs. There's no tourism, which is the main branch of their economy. We think that they can plan for long-term plans, even in the individual way, to plan economical things for the future. We think it's extremely harmful to these people. We want to save that by stable government that you can actually be able to do these trades. And also, secondly, just 2 rights of people. People are literally dying in the streets right now because of the process of the army shooting on them. We want to stop that as soon as possible and much better. The second point of framing is just think that Suu Kyi itself is just not a unique, without a unique importance to the people of Myanmar. Therefore, just what happens to her is just not that important. Why is it true? A, as a prime minister, she was extremely passive. I think that already as a prime minister, the army did whatever they want. They literally did the genocide in north of the state without any interference from the government and not even knowing exactly what they are doing there. I just think they controlled whatever they want even before. She was extremely passive. She's not someone with a big impact. Secondly, just failed. Many people in Myanmar see her as a failure. We just think that she wasn't managed to stop the coup. She wasn't managed to stop the protest. She wasn't managed to control the junta while she was in charge. Many of them even support this coup, but for just a failure. And third of all, just the comparative is the leaders of the protest. I think they get a lot of credit for any step that they will do. With think that they would be much more of a leaders and a symbol for the protest than Suu Kyi that is in jail and is unable to do anything. Therefore, just think that as a person, she's just not relevant. Let's move to the argument. Why just the likelihood of success of actually getting this stable ruling over the junta is much more in our side. We're going to have two ways of analysis which we're going to do that. First, the internal one inside of Burma, and the second is the external one outside from the international support. Let's start with the internal ones. 2 mechanisms for each more likely in the internal matter. First of all, it's just the ability for them to actually prove whatever they need to do. Because I think that in order to save Suu Kyi, they have a prerequisite to prove that she's innocent. I think it's true because we just think in order for the people to respect it, internationally people to respect it, and the junta will actually take the steps in order to stop the trials that they're doing right now. To say, okay, the elections were not a fraud, and all the things that they're already trying to justify. So I think they need to prove that she was actually innocent. I think they're just unable to do so because these things just happened in the past. They can't collect evidence of what happened in elections 8 years ago. They have no resources to actually spend so much money to find this evidence and to prove it. I think that therefore just unlikely to even have the ability to prove she was innocent. On the comparative, we're talking about elections, the things in the future. They're not likely to get this credit that just justification for the new government that we elected. I think they can show in the future that we will collect evidence and prove that it wasn't a fraud. We think that the junta is much more likely now to respect the results because it happens in the future and they're collecting this, that they can prove that it actually not a fraud. I think that therefore just the ability to prove and to get the acceptance of junta whatever happens much more in our side. The second mechanism is justification. Because the thing that the junta will probably resist. They will extremely resist to set free Suu Kyi. We think that just literally they base their coup on it. They will just not just give up and say, okay, we don't care, yeah, everything was a lie. We just think with comparing it to elections, we just think that already the junta promised elections in a few years which would be democratic. It's the main justification they have. now resisting the justification, the international justification they have, explaining that it was a fraud and they're actually trying to fix something. It's something going to be much harder for the junta. If there's already international force from Asia or for the UN that is saying, we will help you do this democratic election without frauds, it will be much harder for them to resist it because it's their main justification they're much more likely going to accept. Second, it is now moving to the external reasons. We just think that there are a lot of external players that will probably want to take part. Players is mainly Asian, but also the UN. I think that we see that Asian really cares about it and wants to intervene in some way because they're discussing it already. There's a lot of pressure from their people to do something about what happens in Myanmar. But we think the question here is, what is the tipping point? Because we see that today they're doing nothing. The main question is, where is the tipping point to actually make them intervene and do something? Why we think the tipping point happened much more on our side. First of all, I think the extent of interference that they need to do. Because if it's intervening in freeing Suu Kyi, they need to intervene in the trial. They need to intervene in facts, what is wrong and what is right, to tell the judges that they don't have authority and jurisdiction over this specific trial. We think that it's also a lot of interference, and also we think that their people are less likely going to support it because it is a very deep interference in the autonomy of the state. On the other side, when you're talking about election, we just think it's much less extent of interference, which you're much more likely to justify. It's only supervision. If something happens in the future, it's much likelier that it will be the tipping point for them actual to get inside. Bottom half.
Who is going to be the international actor who is going to observe these elections?
Yeah, I said Asians probably are going to be the first one, maybe some more from the UN, but most likely Asian at least. Now, the second mechanism here is what we think that what we can give them back internationally, because we think that freeing Suu Kyi would actually almost give them nothing if they're trying to do so. I literally try to intervene in the trial. The likelihood of it to succeed is extremely low. They'll get no benefit from that as an international actor. On the comparative, when we're talking about elections, we give them a lot of power to be part of the process, which is extremely important for them. We let them supervise. We let them send people, the diplomats on the ground and actually be there. We think that this is something that politicians can much more show to their people. No, we are helping Myanmar. Our people are now in Yangon helping people in the streets. They can tell the people, get much more status and say, no, Asian is an important international power. We actually stopped the protest. Note, we are now holding democratic elections in a country that held a coup. I think that being on the ground, being there gives them the power and the benefits they're much more likely going to want to opt into, and it's much more important for politicians. Because we prove to you that it will get much more stable ruling over Myanmar, which will help so many people's lives, both economically and in their life. We beg you to propose.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and now welcome the Leader of Opposition to open the opposition side in this debate here.
Can someone confirm that I'm audible? Okay. 3, 2, 1. I know this is a debate, but we do not agree with the framing that OG gives us, that Suu Kyi was incredibly unpopular. If we case file, we can see that she has actually won the elections just months before the coup by a landslide, meaning that there was a huge populace that supported her, a huge populace that in voting elected her, meaning that also by their own analysis, when they say there are people currently willing to give their lives on the street in protests because they think that there is an injustice that has been done to the person and to the people, it means that they have a personal interest in also going on a huge risk against this military junta, who are much better weaponized than civilians, for this woman, or not specifically maybe for that woman, but the idea that stands behind that woman. And this is the crucial difference. And this person does not only stand for who this person is, but for a whole idea of the position. We think if OG wants to make this a tipping point debate, which seems to be the fucking like every single debate in debate today, then we can say that at the point where OG wants the tipping point to happen, when people intervene or where we have less likely that resistance is going to be more successful, we think that this will more likely happen when people are still suffering and wanting to resist. And see, as soon as people's resistance and the opposition that is able to organize them in a resistance dies down or splinters, that is when it's much easier to break down single groups of opposition and have much less civilian costs, because there is not every day people protesting for the idea of this woman. And there is much less civilian cost also for the military coup, and this also breaks then trickles down to international organizations having much less pressure to actually intervene, because there is not every day in the Western world, etc., pictures, or in neighboring worlds, pictures of how people are brutally being shot in the street. So I think that this is very crucial to keep in mind. Note also an important point of framing is that this opposition that we talk about is not like in a democratic country, the opposition, meaning that less people voted for this party. It's the opposition to a coup, meaning that the opposition is still the majority of people, the majority that has been supported by the people and voted for by the people, which is all democratically elected, or all the parties that have been in a democratic process. And note that previous to this, all these parties had agreed that this is the person and the party who had won the elections, meaning that we are at a crucial point where they do agree that there is someone who is legitimate, that has been elected, and they have agreed to this, and they're opposing someone who is not agreeing to this. What do we think? Why does election not necessarily mean that you have a democratic process and that you actually succeed? Note that there's first of all, they have not given us an analysis why these elections are going to be fair. And note that elections only matter to the point where people actually participate in democracy, and that if you want to prevent people from suffering and actually not having them suffer in the long term, you need to make elections as fair and as accessible as possible. You also need to make people believe that these elections are going to matter. If you don't do that, then the people who are most likely to have the most broadcasting time, or most likely to be have other means of influencing people by by corrupt means, etc., which is also to a great extent ability, then you only legitimize their power over a long term, because in these elections, if you don't have an opposition that actually can run against them, then you have the problem that you legitimize them for a long run. And note that this point in time, when you legitimize them through elections, you have a much bigger problem at hand, because that's when international organizations and others cannot intervene anymore, because they have, through their own observance, legitimized whoever is in power then. So we are at a crucial point in time where we have to think very closely about how we're going to shape the future of this country. Note that at the point where Suu Kyi will not be able to run, it's very questionable who will people rally behind, and also who will be people willing to support. And before I go on to this point, I will take CG.
Yeah, but I mean, if the elections are going to be obviously rigged without international observers, of course, everyone will know they're rigged. As for the elections in former Yugoslavia.
Oh, come on. But Rok, you know that in Serbia, like, the elections are fair and they're not actually fair. That there is, how it works is you give 20 years to someone, then this person gives like 5 years to the people and tells them, oh, vote for this party and I will give you 5 years, etc. This is how it works. This is how it works, like, on the side. And those are things like, there's so many observers in Serbia and still there's rigged elections. I think you have to explain in very detailed analysis how you're going to make sure that there's no rigging at all. And also to the point where there's willingness to have elections at some point in time, and international actors are willing to give these at some point of time. I don't understand why opposition then needs to make this their priority if, as OG claims, there is actually an incentive for international actors to do this either way. So why is there only real opposition outside of the house? Note that internal cohesion is extremely important, because at the they haven't given us analysis why most opposition parties are going to agree on this decision and why this will be actually something that most people will agree with. We think that it's very likely that there will be also people who are very, very loyal to Suu Kyi because she has been elected, etc. And that it's very likely that there will also be the new leaders who then want to get to power, who will then splinter into different parties. Those who are maybe a little bit more friends with the military because they get some benefits from them, or those who are extremely opposed to this. Notice there's also religious diversity in Myanmar, which means that there's more likely to be a splintering of opposition. But secondly, the external support by civilians. Note that loss of voters in case of elections, because you have the delusion of people that opposition is also power hungry and willing to concede to an unjust incarceration, because the justice system is something that people need to believe in. Not that just because you cannot concede, it's like, oh, this is probably unjust and there will be no proof. But it doesn't mean that in the minds of people, this is still something that is just to do, meaning that you have to have them believe in that the opposition is actually standing up for them. Note also that atrocities in the name of the coup are unlikely to be good for the military as well, meaning that if they keep losing civilians, that makes internationals more likely to intervene. So in order for the opposition to have more leverage, is that they have to have people rallying behind them and not rally behind the military or just be disillusioned by the system because they're not actually taking a stance for what they have already legitimately elected. And note that you have to prove to us why people will feel the way that when elections come, these will actually feel fair to the people. Because if you don't, then you don't have a consistent democratic system that can go on. Note that this is not necessarily about not necessarily about who succeeds, but also who is more likely to give a better life to the people in the long term. For all this reason, I'm very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of opening government here.
Am I audible? Sorry, I was waiting to hear you and I didn't. So I'm guessing that means I am audible. And this is what I need. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Look, panel, we win this debate in 3 ways. The first is we set a metric of stability and people's lives getting better. Notice that that is not necessarily contingent on a fair election. It is contingent on people's lives being more stable and not being shot at in the street like they are now. That's the first thing to note. Second, we show likelihood of success of getting and beating that metric in 2 ways. We show more internal things, more internal support, and more external support in ways that I will detail. And the last is I'm also just going to show why we're more likely to keep the stability in the long term, basically winning also on what OO just conceded was their metric. First, a few points of external rebuttal. On the extent of popular support that Suu Kyi has. First of all, notice that the larger the margin she won the elections by, the more plausible it makes the claims that it was a corrupt election sound, and the more likely it is that people believe that to some extent it was corrupt. We don't think that it is a lot of people, or we don't know how many people believe or don't, but the more the margin was big, the easier it is to convince. Second, we think that there was already once a military regime in Myanmar in the 90s, and we think that people accuse CU that she didn't stop them, Suu Kyi that she didn't stop them. So we think that many people believe that she is supportive of the military, and in that context, we don't think that the support is to the extent that OO claim. What does this mean when we compare the likelihood and what is if losing these supporters is so bad? Let's compare between the people we are able to get on our side because the claims we are making are more justifiable as opposed to Suu Kyi specifically. First of all, let's talk about the likelihood of continued support for the cause. People who really believed in Suu Kyi view her as a means to an end and will also stand to get rid of the junta and have a democratic leader because they believe in both of those things. The people who are convinced by the junta, if the comparison is someone they believed is corrupt, are just unlikely to support you in any way. Second mechanism, the likelihood to work against you. Supporters of Suu Kyi might still support having a democratic leader and what the opposition stand for because they think the junta are bad and did bad things. And therefore, even if they don't want to actively support you, they don't want to actively work against you because working against you hurts their ultimate goal and cause, as opposed to people who are supporters of the junta or convinced by them, who think it's wrong to put a corrupt politician back in place. So if that's what the opposition stand for, are likely to actively want to work against this. Even if they're not supporters of the junta, but just people who support opposition but don't necessarily support Suu Kyi, they're more likely to splinter and create this division that OO is so scared of under their side of the house. We also just think it's easier for the junta to point blame at people who so strongly believe in Suu Kyi. It's very easy for them to say, look, you are personally bad and actively discredit them because they actively claim that she is corrupt and are going to put her on trial for that matter, as opposed to people who are supportive of them and supportive of the democratic cause. It's very hard to personally attack them because then it's breaking the trust because they don't have the justification to personally attack them. That means if we're comparing the kinds of people we're gaining or losing on either side, we think it's more important that we gain the people that we're gaining when we claim to want democratic elections than to support someone who some people think is corrupt and it's just a harder thing to stand by. Second, on the question of whether we're succeeding in an election, First of all, notice that I don't understand their comparative. What do they think happens when Suu Kyi is free? I have no idea. I don't think that they prove that she's going to have any election or make people's lives better. We've proven that in the past, she's already been very passive. She's already allowed the military a lot of power. And we think now she's likely to just be able to do that again and be scared to do things because she probably has trauma or fear that she's going to be put back in prison and have to experience all this all over again. So she's not going to take a strong stance. Second, if the alternative is an election by the junta, like they claim is going to happen, then we don't know why it's going to be fairer. Third, we're not sure if the alternative is continued fighting, then a fair election is the most important thing. We think even the election is a little rigged or slightly unfair. At least it allows for a stable government that will allow people some form of stability. They can go out in the street without fear of being shot. They can plan ahead how they're going to live their lives and have jobs and therefore have some form of economic stability and ability to have that kind of things for themselves and not be in physical danger. But lastly, we do think that it's going to be done well. Why? Because we think the likely alternative is ASEAN, people that are from like Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia and around there. We think that this is likely because of the proximity and because they have an active interest in the trade between them. Why is it likely to be done well? First of all, we think that these are countries like Thailand who want more of the stage on the international trading market. They want to prove their ability. Second, we think some form of UN intervention is likely, and they want to prove that they are trustworthy to them as well. Third, they have an active interest in putting someone trustworthy and not corrupt in government because they want to be able to trust the trade agreements. And lastly, they're going to want to make sure that it's stable for the same reason of trade agreements. We think for all of these things, they're likely to do this well. Before I continue and explain the long-term impacts of this, sure, I'll take closing.
Aung San Suu Kyi is an incredibly prominent public figure. She was under house arrest for 20 years, from 1990 to 2010, and she still came out and ran for elections after that. Why do you think this is going to be the tipping point that stops her from going for power again after she's freed?
I mean, she might after she's free, but it's going to be a lot harder. And if she's free and then she runs and there's another democratic election and she wins, we're fine with that. I don't know, like she might as well just do that. I think that the oppositions have a claim to say that they did the best they could under the circumstances and paved the way for her to come into power later and are likely to try and frame things that way. So I don't think it's going to be actively harmful to that. Let's talk about the long-term impacts. We think that there's just likely to be far more longer term and external involvement in watching and making sure things are stable when you have elections. We think that these countries have taken an active part. Their reputation is affected by the outcome, and the personal involvement of people in the long-term process means that they are actively sympathetic and more likely to lean towards intervention versus when you just free Suu Kyi. Once she's freed, it's her responsibility what she does. And if she fails, you're less affected by it and you're less involved. Two, the just likelihood of another coup. Once there are elections, because of the other international observers, the junta can't say again that they were corrupt without actively offending people who might be their trading partners or the people they want to have involvement with in the future, which means that they are far less likely to do that when there was international involvement versus when Suu Kyi runs again, when they're likely to want to paint her as corrupt to justify their past actions. So they're more likely to have to enact that again. Third, the power of oppositions and resilience. Notice that even if they fail, even when they succeed, it shows more legitimate leaders and more of their ability to continue to run. Even in the future elections they fail, it shows that they are able to do things and able to get that kind of outcome and international involvement. Suu Kyi, she's the only leader. So if she fails, it's likely to paint the whole cause as something that is ineffective. We also showed you why we're likely to get less splintering and more internal stability on our side. And we've also explained to you why she's going to be hesitant. At the bottom line of this, what do we show you? We show you the most likely case for making people's lives a lot better in the day-to-day and in the short term. We've also already shown you that in the long run, this is likely to be more stable and we're saving more people's lives in the long term. And lastly, we just set the metric and justify it. For those reasons, please propose.
I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech and now welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close out talk off.
Thank you. Can you please confirm that I'm audible? OG themselves say that stability is the means to the end of people having better lives. You also get stability if people give up and stop resisting. It's short term, it's more oppressive, and it's definitely not desirable. There was a stable military rule in Myanmar in the 90s that did not end well for anyone but for the powerful. I don't know why this is desirable, but if you look at Myanmar, to the extent that a vast number of people are willing to go on the streets knowing they might get shot for it in order to protest the junta, it is very clear that their preference is not for stability, it is for freedom, and it is for Suu Kyi. So to to the extent that any stability will be good, that kind of assumes that opposition has to win this election. And we explain to you why this is less likely. But also notice that the motion is not talking about giving up on anything. It is about prioritizing. So what that means, it is not we either get this or the other one necessarily, because realistically, you might not get either, right? But you can still fight for both. The question is, which is logically preceding the other one? We tell you it is absolutely freeing Suu Kyi, right? So not only that, but the precedent of having your leader imprisoned and then leaving them to be abandoned and rot in jail at the point where it is no longer convenient for you to stand behind them is not going to make the opposition look much better, right? So when OG tries to claim that Suu Kyi was extremely passive and is not actually that popular, she won re-election recently in the landslide. To the extent that OG thinks that just the more of a win she had, the more that shows that she was corrupt, I think that the more people go on the streets protesting for her release, the more the landslide in which she won is being justified, especially since people are literally giving their lives because this is their priority. But also, to the extent that OG thinks Suu Kyi is not that important and not that consequential because she didn't really do much, they don't really look at how history works, because people who are consequential are not necessarily those who enact the most change quietly, but they are those who are the most visible. So even if she is useless in terms of policy, she is the most important figure in Myanmar because she has been assigned that importance for being a hero of the resistance for the decades that she was in prison and still came back after, and for the fact that right now she's the martyr of the opposition, quietly fighting an uphill battle against the junta rather than just someone who is useless, as OG seems to think, right? But also, just on the idea that in order to save her, the opposition would have to prove she's innocent, and it's hard to do because you can't go back in time decades to find evidence. Notice that to the extent there is huge scrutiny and all of the power that the opposition has to put scrutiny on something goes towards her trial, which is immediate, you have to do it now, the burden of proof in trials is still going to be to show that she is guilty. So the more attention there is on that trial, the less ability it is for the junta to get away with the fabricated claims that she was corrupt, the harder it is to fake, and the harder it is to actually imprison her. But not only that, if at this point the opposition abandons her and leaves her in jail because she has been caught on charges of corruption, they will probably just look as if tacitly they agree with the fact that she is corrupt, she was caught, we can't save her, so we'll abandon now. But they will still have supported her for literally a decade before, so they would still look as if they supported a corrupt person for as long as it was convenient for them, and then discard her. So regardless of whether people believe that she is corrupt or not, either way, if the opposition now abandons her, they end up looking much worse. Marina already said that to the extent that elections were already promised by the junta, it's unclear why we can't get them later. But what is a definite delta in this debate is if you demand immediate elections and get them, Suu Kyi can absolutely not run because she is now on trial, because she is now in jail. I think people support the opposition because they are supposed to be better than the junta, and they are definitely not better if they use people as a means to be in power and then discard them regardless of how corrupt they are and regardless of anything. The fact that the junta will just oppose her being released doesn't mean anything. Like, obviously they will try to put an opposition. The question is, on our side of the house, you make that opposition much, much harder and also much less likely to succeed, meaning that you increase the chances of her being released. But also just on the idea that, well, you get ASEAN to intervene because they already kind of want to, you need to give them a tipping point, and it's much easier to interfere in elections. Like, I think it's much easier to supervise a trial, especially when there is no actual evidence against her and you can point to that. But like, supervising elections, I know it sounds really chill because it's just supervising, you just observe, but like on a granular level, just following how voters go into every village, who actually turns up versus who is marked as having turned up on the election list, and also where do the votes go, who counts the votes, do votes disappear or not on the way. Like, if even the US, after so much history of free and fair elections, struggle with getting this shit done, and given that there is literally no precedent that I could think of where international supervision of elections actually meant free and fair elections, I don't think this is going to be as easy as the government thinks. But also, even if that were the alternative, I still think freeing Suu Kyi should be the crucial thing. Panel, if I choose to give away money to a robber because I have to save my life because there's a gun to my head, I might have chosen to give away the money. But my choice was not free because the situation in which I made that free choice was specifically engineered by the robber so that I would choose the lesser evil, which is still an evil. So voting in an engineered election in which the only person who is likely to successfully oppose the junta is already left out of the election by default is not a good election. We don't want to have it just for the sake of, oh, election's good. I will take closing.
What are the junta's incentives for staying in power, and how do they change when the opposition changes strategy?
So I think the junta's incentives for staying in power are unlikely to change. What I am explaining to you is that if the resistance is focusing on freeing Suu Kyi first and then having free elections, that means that they are, one, more powerful in terms of actually getting her freed and and to letting her run. Two, they look more powerful, which again means the more free the elections are, the more likely they are to win. Even if there aren't completely free elections, clearly the more support they have, the easier it is for them to win regardless, right? So Marina has explained to you why it's unclear who is a viable replacement for the opposition and status quo. There is no response to that. Marina has explained to you why a lot of the reasons why people are willing to literally to either go vote or literally risk their lives is for Suu Kyi specifically, and because she has been turned into a martyr rather than this amorphous movement that just abandons their hero. And also, I have given you a lot of analysis on why, regardless of whether people believe she's corrupt or not, her being abandoned by the opposition necessarily weakens the optics of the opposition. Also, Marina told you about the internal splintering of support for the opposition because a lot of people are still loyal to her. They are going to oppose this choice, but also the ability for the junta to engineer who opposes them in the election increases at the point at which there is no viable leader of the opposition. I think if you care at all about the well-being of the Myanmar people, you will agree that the best course of action for the opposition is to first focus on freeing Suu Kyi and then on elections. Very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech, and now welcome the Member of Government to open back half. Here.
Is the sound okay? Perfect. Starting now. Panel, 2 points of direct engagement with the top half of the debate before going into my extension. One, recognize that none of the teams analyze the direct incentives that the military junta has to stay in power. OO says, oh, no, they've just taken power by force and then they'll give up power just freely because, and I quote, they promised to do so. Here's why this is unlikely to be true, because of the structural incentives that the junta has to stay in power. 4 of them. One, recognize that given that they were willing to, sacrifice and go to great distance to, take it by force, it's unlikely for them to give away this power because they are power-hungry individuals who wish to influence things as much as possible. Secondly, it's unlikely that they will give it up because they want to control the resources of the country to be able to do with them as they can, to manage it and send their own people in order to profit for themselves and their military bodies. But thirdly, even before that, recognize that even before the military coup, military had like 90 seats, I don't know the percentage, but a lot of seats in parliament were reserved specifically for members of the military, which means that this shows to you how the military has a direct incentive to stay in power. But fourthly, recognize that if we all agree that the coup is bad, it's likely that the people who perpetrated the coup are likely to face some sort of persecution or penalties after the free elections by the government who's in place, which makes unlikely for the military coup perpetrators to give up their power for fear of penalties from the new government. Hence, it's unlikely that they will welcome any elections, just freely. What we say to you, if elections will happen, it will happen through concessions, and this will be our second argument. But the second point of engagement is with OG's case. Recognize that the majority of OG's case, and I hope I'm not being too uncharitable, is contingent upon them making the claim that elections will A, happen, and 2, be completely unrigged. And the majority of their arguments just go to prove why a stable society, is beneficial, which I think is out of the motion. I think their burden was to show to you how uniquely focusing and prioritizing on, the demanding of elections as opposed to freeing Suu Kyi is beneficial. And this is what me and Rook are doing uniquely on extending them. And the most important argument in this debate, why we're taking it. First, extension. Recognize that Aung San Suu Kyi is a very polarizing figure in Myanmar society, which is to say that, the direct involvement of setting her to be the face of the oppositional movement is likely to weaken the oppositional movement in itself, thereby making their demands for free elections far less likely under opposition's work. 3 layers of analysis. One, recognize that even OO concedes that the movement is very diverse. We can say that, why is this so? Because the majority of the population can very easily unite against the current military junta, because they see people who, as they say, are getting shot in the streets, which is like, very simply, it's very simple to be against people dying on the streets. But secondly, recognize that as of now, there are, many people of diverse backgrounds also in parts of the movement, i.e. people of, different ethnic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, or, prior political opposition before the junta, because those were the groups who were recognized prior to that, directly excluded under the government of Aung San Suu Kyi. How? Because, the Aung San Suu Kyi government literally oversaw the Rohingya genocide, was complicit in the dying of the, ethnic minority of Rohingya, who recognized were also the religious minority, thereby, antagonizing a significant portion of Myanmar population. So it's very unlikely that these people will, welcome Aung San Suu Kyi becoming the face of the opposition and just, welcomed fighting for her when she was literally the person who was complicit in the dying of Rohingya minorities. Thereby, they're significantly alienating a big portion of the opposition. Second layer of analysis, recognize that this takes away the focus of the opposition movement from concrete issues into, discussing the moral character of Aung San Suu Kyi, as OG tell you, all these legal trials and whatnot. Why is this wrong? Under OG's metric, if they want to have a stable economic society, you're unlikely to achieve that at the point of which you aren't discussing actual economic or social policy, but merely, debating and bickering on the, moral character of a single politician who is in question. We say no. By advocating for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, you are directly taking the focus away from everyday issues that the people in the opposition are most motivated. Because people protest primarily because their livelihoods are at stake, because they have, horrible lives, not because of, some moral righteousness that they have to defend for Aung San Suu Kyi. Granted, some part of the population is likely very fervent supporters of Aung San Suu Kyi. OO doesn't characterize how many there are. We think not so many, granted how, horrible she has been to the majority of the population. But we say that an equal amount of people, if not more, are fervent opposition to Aung San Suu Kyi and, are unlikely to fight on her behalf. Furthermore, three impacts from this. Recognize that one, by making Aung San Suu Kyi the face of the movement, you take away the media space because for other issues, because she takes up all of it and the discussion. Two, you get less international support for oppositional movements because they can say, you see, even the opposition isn't united. It's, in internal politics bickering, we shouldn't intervene or try to help it. And three, you're disparaging the opposition. Recognize the weighing of the impacts in 2 points. One, you have a weaker oppositional movement because one, you have numerically less supporters, but two, you have less intense supporters because people who are willing to intensely fight against the junta are now, entirely out of the question because they aren't willing to fight for Aung San Suu Kyi. And three, you have less justification for international support because the opposition is divided. Before moving on, I'll take closing. No, I'll take opening.
If you're saying that the junta will oppose supervised elections, I think you're opening. If you say the military will rig them, that gets easier when you set the precedent. They can take out any opposition leader with made-up corruption charges, and they'll be abandoned by their party.
Thank you. No, we reject the premise of this argument. We say it's more likely that the junta will make concessions, as would be my second extension. One, recognize that we have limited political capital to spare. And by making, the claim that we should release Aung San Suu Kyi, we're using that political capital that the junta was willing to give to us to achieve no concrete benefits. Recognize that the junta will be less scared of the opposition if, the primary face of the movement or prior government is in jail. So it means that they're likely to make more concessions for the opposition movement, i.e. fair elections. Furthermore, it's likely that, given the benefit of what we should do, free Aung San Suu Kyi or, engage in fair elections, using our political capital to spend on freeing Aung San Suu Kyi gives you no concrete benefits, as, I've shown to you, and doesn't give you any concrete benefits of why this politician is so, uniquely beneficial. We say, if anything, it takes away the focus and the benefits you get from having a strong oppositional movement. On a comparative, you have, therefore, less international support, both because the populations of different countries don't know who to support directly, but also because different media don't know how to shape the situation and who to portray as the good and the bad guy, thereby making the situation even more, making it harder to justify concrete benefits.
I would like to thank the member of government for that fine speech. Before welcoming the member of opposition, could I clarify with Orcom that the stream is paused? Orcom, are you around? with. I would also like to alert Orcom to the fact that presumably the stream can now be restarted. However, I think it's fine if we can just proceed.
Okay, so you might wonder, why did Philip spend 1 minute of his speech talking about how change is unlikely to happen, because the junta has these incentives to stay in power and they will never give the power away. But that framing is extremely important for this debate, and it's the one that will make CG win the debate, and I will tell you soon why. So essentially, what either team on opposition needs to prove in order to achieve something in this debate is engage on two levels in this round. One, that opposition, in fact, will be stronger with Suu Kyi released from the jail. Here, I think that opposition does have some argumentation, how some people are loyal to her, although this is symmetric because they're probably loyal to the cause of democratic elections now, how she has a degree of political support also from abroad and similar things. They're not really engaging with what Philip told you in what was essentially an analysis tension on OG, on why the movement itself will be weakened if we have a leader, if we have now a movement with a leader and with this particular leader, right? So essentially it was a very abstract argument that extended on OG, and OG just said that, okay, then it's easier to target that person and personally discredit them. But Philip analyzed how now there is less focus on what the opposition as a whole is doing, what are the personal struggles of individuals, what issues are being faced in Myanmar, because now all the spotlight is again around Suu Kyi, which is already a controversial issue. And then if there's no focus on regular issues, regular struggles, it's less likely to get any kind of political capital from abroad or any kind of change to happen. And secondly, the second thing that the opposition team should engage on is to show us why, even if we have a stronger opposition movement, there is going to be an election, and why in that case the government will concede to have the elections, and that they will give away some parts of their power. I think that the both opposition benches are here extremely naive in claiming that the government will simply cede power and do something where we have analyzed that they're unlikely to do so. That's why we say on CG, it's likely a very marginal impact debate. Both scenarios are highly unlikely, but let us please leave this issue of Suu Kyi away from us. It's a controversial issue. It's something in the past, also because of the symbolic value. The junta is maybe irrationally perhaps afraid of them. They're never going to leave it up. So let's just talk to the government, talk to the junta in a way that maybe we can get some kind of concessions. And here, the important thing is that we don't really have to analyze the likelihood of this scenario to a very great extent, because opening opposition says this is what's likely to do when we campaign for elections. They say, the government will have will make elections and they're likely to be rigged, they're likely to going to do all this stuff, even in the international, because probably they won't concede to the fullest extent, that they will have international observers and get all the mechanisms of control that OG talked about. But I mean, we are saying that this is frankly like a great scenario that can happen, that we have some kind of an elections, even if they're rigged, like CEO says, there are no people who will run at elections, which is silly. I mean, you will have more ordinary people running and maybe some minorities. You will have at least some campaigning done from the junta, because they will want to show that the turnout was great. So in that way, they will get legitimacy. You would have some kind of dialogue, which is way better than what is happening now, when you have complete autocracy happening. Like even in Serbia, where you have like rigged elections and so that, I mean, you still have now the president Vučić going to the people, talking to them, incentivizing to go to the elections, because it is in his interest to present his rigged elections as fair as possible, even if it is on a spectrum. Okay, I will take 00 now, and then I'll engage with CEO.
Why is an election between engineered choices, one, desirable, and two, likely to lead to anything else than strengthening and legitimating an oppressive regime?
Yeah, I mean, because even if there are rigged elections, there still are elections where some kind of effort has to be made by the government to gain some kind of a turnout, which means that they have to campaign, they need to promise some policies. Even if you have a fake opposition, like really taking it the best, like completely fake, useless opposition, still they do present some kind of a policy alternatives, still you have some kind of a political discussions. Because, I mean, if this strengthens an oppressive regime, well, maybe it is strengthened and it is then more stable, and like OG analyzes the benefits of that. But I mean, you really need to engage with the counterfactual. I mean, what is the comparative, right? Even if you have, if you have free and fair elections, which will never happen because of the incentives that the junta has now, that they will not just see the elections, and opposition doesn't prove the benefits of Aung San Suu Kyi to such an extent that suddenly they will have a revolution and they will overthrow the government. If that's the case, right, if they're right in their analysis, then for sure government will never let Suu Kyi out. But they're not right when analyze you at this extent. So I mean, that is the alternative. And we need to consider that even when Aung San Suu Kyi was leading the country, right, before the coup happened, this was also an oppressive regime, right? We told you about the genocide that was happening. The military had a huge influence in the parliament, right? 25% of seats were reserved for the members of the military in a so-called democratic Myanmar. I mean, that sounds like an oppressive regime to me. And if we return to something similar, as opposed to this conflict that's happening now on the streets with this huge oppression happening by this government, it's highly likely that things will get better. Because at the point when the government is seen as more legitimate, this evil government like the junta now, they don't need to oppress people that much anymore because they are seen as more legitimate, they have more legitimacy, and they don't have the incentives to do all the bad stuff. Now direct engagement with CO. I don't think that, okay, I think there are a couple of things. One is on international connections of Suu Kyi. Here, I really don't see how is this important, because if you international community wants to influence Myanmar, they need to have some kind of leverage, right? And what leverage will they use? Like sanctions, military interventions? Like if they, I mean, so this means that they might use these things, which would be horrible for the people of Burma, because it will even like either create military conflict or worsen living conditions there, right? And there are some other issues on who will run in the elections, which I already told you that it's not happening. And thirdly, when they talk about how this will calm down the population, like the junta will think that this will calm down the population by giving these concessions to the opposition. That's what they will do it. I mean, that this is in direct contradiction with OO, because OO talks about Aung San Suu Kyi will revitalize opposition, and they will, then rise up and do whatever, overthrow them. When CO says no, this will pacify everything. That's why junta will do it. I think they don't have that much then of an extension. I'm very proud to propose.
I would like to thank the government for that fine speech, and I welcome the opposition whip to close opposition bench in this debate as a whole.
Hey, am I audible and visible? Great, thank you. I'll begin my speech in 3. Before my POIs in the chat, please. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, and 1. I can't believe I'm doing this in op-whip, but okay, one layer of characterization. Why is Suu Kyi popular, right? This has come out throughout the debate, but I'll just summarize all of this right now. First of all, like Zahari told you, historic reasons, right? She's the reason there's still a country and not a bunch of fractured city-states due to ethnic conflicts, right? She's the only reason that Myanmar can call itself an independent country. Second, well, it's obvious that she won the election overwhelmingly, right? They tell you the only sort of opposition we get is, oh, look, Rohingya genocide, right? 2 things, panel. The genocide has been going on since 2015. The elections were last year. If the Rohingyas was such a large majority, then she wouldn't have won the elections. B, as they already characterized for you, the military has 45% reserved seats already, and the atrocities are being perpetrated by the military on the people of the Rohingyas, right? Anyone with half a brain knows that the military is behind this, and not Suu Kyi personally, right? So even if first of all, the Rohingyas aren't going to be against her, but even if they aren't in the majority, and this is shown by election results, right? But third, and most obviously, the opposition by definition are literally people who are protesting right now because Suu Kyi and other leaders have been wrongfully imprisoned, right? Which means that they must care. And since it's an actor motion, since we're talking about the opposition, we can assume that they do care at this point, right? Keeping all this in mind, let's talk about CG, right? First of all, panel, they spent 3 minutes of their speeches telling you why the junta has incentives to keep power, right? Great. Then they give you one line on why the junta will have elections, which if they are fair, are all but confirmed to throw away this power, right? If you have immediate elections, the junta isn't going to remain in power right now. Zahari gave you reasons why the elections are going to be rigged in order to keep this power. But B, panel, they aren't going to get these elections in the first place, right? And even if they do, they are going to be rigged. Keeping this in mind, let's tell you what actually they told you, right? They said, look, we need more concessions, right? Because if their leader is in jail, like they will win the thing overall, right? So they want to pretend like it's a free and fair election, but then like they'll just take over, right? Panel, we don't want an election which is just a mockery, right? We don't want a free and fair election on paper if it still means the junta takes part. OG and CG make this fatal flaw, right? Where they say, look, we care most about stability, because they assume just a democratically supervised election means people accept the results of this election, right? If me, my friends, and every single neighbor I know has voted for Aung San Suu Kyi, but the results say, oh, look, by the way, the junta won 95% of the seats, right? Psych. At that point, we know that the internationally fair election is still rigged, and irrespective, or like people, even if it's fair on paper, because structural disincentives that all sides on our bench have already told you, people haven't been able to participate in the election to the extent that they would have to, and hence the junta has won the seats. Right? No one's going to accept this sort of verdict as a fair election and suddenly going to chill and peace out, right? At this point, we don't get any sort of change. We don't get a democratically elected government. We don't get a stable government on closing government's side, right? But let's move on to opening government, right? Because they at least had some more angles, right? They do two main things, two main avenues to change, right? First, internal, second, external. Let's tell you why there's no internal change and then no external change. The internal change next. First of all, did you get proof that she's innocent, right? And then you can show that she's chill and then she comes out anyways. Panel, it's Myanmar. They're going to run kangaroo courts irrespective of what proof you bring up. They're going to tell you, look, psych, she's guilty anyways. She goes to jail. She isn't going to be able to run in whatever election that they have 30 years from now, right? The reason the junta is going to have elections and in some indefinite date in the future, they're only going to have it when they're sure they're going to win, right? But second is the fact that people love Aung San Suu Kyi, and she's the only one who has the actual sort of potential to bring about that internal change, right? At this point, people are protesting and they want to vote for their leaders. They aren't going to vote for some nobodies who is their counterfactual, right? They said, if everyone's in prison, we'll just vote for random people who pop up. You aren't going to vote for random people who pop up because A, you have no connection to them, B, they can be propped up by the government. Like so propped up by the junta, you have no idea. You're going to vote only for the people you recognize. If you don't recognize, you're not going to participate in the election. It's going to legitimize the junta, right? Let's tell you their MECs for external support then. Two criteria of MEC, right? One, perception. They tell you, oh, look, ASEAN needs to sort of come in and show to the world that they're doing something. They're already showing to the world that they're doing something. They all put out strong statements saying, oh, look, we're against whatever's happening in Myanmar, right? If optics was the only thing that mattered, that would do it, right? But second, they're already doing things like contributing food aid. They're actually trying to help people on the ground. International organizations have already been deployed. So optics is in the MEC, which actually matters in this debate, right? But second, they tell you, oh, look, they want sort of relations with a stable government, right? I've already told, they told you about trade relations or whatever, export relations and whatnot, right? I've already shown you why the government, which is going to happen in their best case, is going to be a government of the junta anyways, and isn't going to be stable in any shape or form, right? At that point, they aren't going to have the stable government all their MECs sort of rely on. At this point, they don't get international support, they don't get internal support, they have no change. Go, OG.
Even if other teams prove equal chances of election, any team that wants to beat us needs to prove more long-term stability than the 6 mechanisms he showed you, like more international involvement, longer-term international involvement, the interests of ASEAN for a fair election, the ability to get proof of future fraud versus impossibility of past innocence.
Okay, perfect. So I'll tell you why we get actual stability, right? On their side, they've already conceded that they don't get the elections, right? But panel note, if you pay attention to Zahari's speech, our MECs weren't that we get free and fair elections tomorrow, right? And this is where we sort of contrast from OO, because OO showed you that, oh, look, elections are going to be unfair, but they don't show you why we get to the elections point in the first place, right? Let's assume for once that there are eventually going to be some free and fair elections, right? And Zahari's already told you why in the near future they're going to lose them. But it doesn't matter, panel, if what you push for in this debate, right? Because this is what the opposition parties are going to stand for, right? They have no fiat to assume that it actually happens. We already told you, right, on their side that you, A, don't have elections because there's no incentive for the junta to throw away their power. B, if you have elections, it's completely in the incentive of the junta to rig these elections. And even if they don't rig these elections, it's in their incentive to make sure that opposition parties don't stand, so they lose even a fair election on paper. So on their side, panel, the junta is going to be in power either way, right? In their best case situation. On our side, what we told you is that once you release Suu Kyi, we told you why they released Suu Kyi. We told you because the junta has no way to sort of quell the protests right now. And the only way we do that is by releasing Suu Kyi, right? Panel note, there's sort of a straw man about, oh no, people telling you that if they release Suu Kyi, there'll be more protests, right? There can't be more protests than there are right now. There are people literally on the streets dying every day. day, Suu Kyi is the only chance to make the protest die down as she did in the 1980s, right? At this point, panel, and we told you that Suu Kyi is also an incredible bargaining chip for them, which they would be willing to let out, right? At this point, we tell you that you're going to get international pressure, which is going to bring not in elections tomorrow, but is going to bring some sort of relaxation. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the opposition for that fine speech and everyone for a very engaging debate. One final round of applause for everyone who participated.
Vale, silencio porque voy a encender el micro.
Sí, esta es la tierra que te acogió cuando lo necesitaste. La que se puso a tus pies para que la descubrieras. Es la tierra que saboreaste con los tuyos y de la que guardas infinitos momentos. Sí, en ella descubriste la inmensidad del mar y la fortaleza de la montaña. Conociste el poder de la piedra y la fuerza del viento. Sí, también hubo un día en el que tocaste fondo, pero la pureza del agua hizo que te levantases. Sí, aquí fue donde te dejaste atrapar por la historia, arropado por la grandeza del pasado y los más puros sonidos ancestrales. Y sí, ahora que hiciste todo eso, sigamos descubriendo más. En Lugo, sí,